Abigail's earliest memories were woven with the scent of warm bread and the soft cadence of her mother's voice reading scripture by the hearth. The small village where she grew up, cradled between rolling hills and a winding river, was a place where the wind seemed to carry echoes of ancient tales. Her mother, Miriam, was a woman of quiet strength, her hands rough from years of labor, her eyes bright with a faith that never dimmed. Every evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with hues of amber and rose, Miriam would gather Abigail close and open the worn leather Bible. "Listen, my dove," she'd say, her voice steady as stone. "Loyalty isn't just a word. It's a gift from God, a treasure He plants in us to reflect His heart." She'd turn the brittle pages to the story of Ruth, her finger tracing the words as she read of a woman who clung to Naomi, refusing to abandon her even when the world offered easier paths. "Where you go, I will go," Miriam would quote, her eyes meeting Abigail's with a knowing look. "And your God will be my God." That's where loyalty begins, Abigail. With God. When you honor Him above all, everything else falls into place. For those words sank deep into Abigail's young heart, like seeds in fertile soil, waiting for the right season to bloom. As she grew, the village around her hummed with life, but not all of it was beautiful. She heard whispers of broken promises, marriages unraveling over petty quarrels, friendships dissolving in the heat of gossip, trust shattered like clay pots dropped on stone. By the time she was 12, she'd seen girls her age chase after fleeting romances, bending their values to fit the whims of boys who cared little for their hearts. The world seemed to prize convenience over commitment, feelings over faithfulness. But Abigail felt a pull towards something different, something deeper. Her mother's lessons echoed in her mind, and she began to see loyalty not as a burden, but as a calling, a thread that could tie her life to something eternal. At 16, on a crisp spring morning, Abigail walked alone to the riverbank where the water ran clear and cold. The village was quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves and the gentle rush of the current. She knelt on the mossy ground, her hands clasped, and whispered a prayer that would shape her life. "Lord, I give you my heart. Let your truth be my guide, your will my path. I want to honor you above all else." The wind stirred as if in answer, and a peace settled over her, warm and unshakable. She rose with a resolve that felt both new and ancient, a promise to let God's voice drown out the noise of the world. Years later, that resolve faced its first true test. Abigail was 19 when her father, a farmer with a laugh as big as the fields he tilled, fell ill. His strength faded with each passing day, and the family's livelihood teetered on the edge of ruin. The harvest had been meager, and debts piled high. Neighbors, well-meaning but pragmatic, pressed Abigail to consider a solution. A wealthy suitor from a nearby town, a man with land and gold, but no love for God. "He could save your family," they urged, their voices a chorus of practicality. "A girl like you could win him easily." Abigail's stomach twisted at the thought. She'd seen the man once, his eyes cold, his words sharp, his faith a mere rumor he dismissed with a shrug. To marry him would mean abandoning the promise she'd made by the river, trading her devotion for security. Nights grew restless as she wrestled with the choice, her father's cough echoing through the thin walls of their home. One evening, alone in the dim light of a flickering lamp, she opened the Bible to Matthew 22:37. "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind." The words pierced her doubt like a shaft of sunlight through storm clouds. She closed her eyes and prayed, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I trust you, Lord. I won't turn from you, not even now." The next morning she declined the suitor with a calm that surprised even herself. The villagers shook their heads, muttering about foolishness, but Abigail felt free. Days later, a miracle unfolded. A distant relative, long forgotten, arrived with a sack of grain and a promise to help. The family's home was spared, and Abigail's faith grew roots deeper than ever. She saw it as God's hand, a reward for choosing Him over comfort. Time passed, and Abigail's life took a new turn when she met Daniel, a carpenter with hands calloused from work and eyes that shone with kindness. He wasn't loud or boastful like the men who strutted through the village square. He was steady, his words few but weighty. They met one Sabbath as he repaired a bench outside the synagogue, his hammer tapping a rhythm she found oddly comforting. She offered him water, and they fell into conversation. Simple at first, about the weather and the harvest, then deeper, about faith and purpose. Daniel spoke of God with a reverence that matched her own, and soon their meetings became a quiet routine. They'd sit by the river reading scripture together, their voices blending as they prayed. "I don't need a wife who follows me blindly," he said one evening, his gaze earnest. "I need one who follows God first." Abigail smiled, her heart stirring. Their courtship wasn't marked by grand gestures or lavish gifts, but by a shared devotion that felt like home. When he asked her to marry him, she said yes, not out of fleeting emotion, but because she saw in him a partner who honored the same God she did. Their love wasn't a wildfire that burned bright and fast. It was a hearth fire, steady and warm, built on a foundation neither time nor trial could shake. Abigail knew then that her loyalty, forged in faith, would guide her through whatever lay ahead. Abigail's marriage to Daniel settled into her life like the rhythm of the seasons, each day a quiet testament to the vows they'd spoken under a canopy of oak trees 2 summers past. The village stretched out around their modest home, its thatched roof and wooden walls a sanctuary built by Daniel's hands and Abigail's care. She loved the simplicity of it, the creak of the floorboards, the scent of sawdust that clung to Daniel's clothes, the way the morning light spilled through the window as they knelt together in prayer. But simplicity didn't mean ease, and the first real test of their union came with a drought that gripped the land like a vice. The river shrank to a trickle, fields withered under a relentless sun, and the hum of the village turned to murmurs of worry. Daniel's carpentry work, once steady as the tides, began to dry up. People bartered for bread instead of benches, and the coins in their clay jar dwindled. One evening, Daniel trudged home, his shoulders slumped, his face etched with weariness. "I promised a table to old Jacob," he said, his voice low, "but he can't pay until the harvest. If there even is one, I shouldn't have agreed." Abigail's heart sank at the risk, a knot tightening in her chest. They needed that money for grain, for oil, for survival. She could have let frustration spill out, sharp words cutting through the tension like a blade. But as she looked at him, his brow furrowed with guilt, she remembered the scripture they'd read together. Matthew 5:37. "Let your yes be yes and your no, no." She'd vowed to be his partner, not his accuser, to stand with him in trust, not tear him down in doubt. She took a breath, steadying herself, and placed a hand on his arm. "I trust you'll make it right," she said, her voice firm yet soft. "Let's pray over it." They knelt by the hearth, their words rising to God like smoke, asking for provision, for wisdom, for peace. The next day, Daniel delivered the table, his hands trembling as he set it in Jacob's dusty home. The old man's eyes widened, and he pressed 2 coins into Daniel's palm, double what they'd agreed. "For your honesty," Jacob rasped, "and your wife's prayers." Abigail saw it as God's faithfulness, a reward for keeping their word when it would have been easier to bend. That moment became a cornerstone, a quiet proof that her loyalty wasn't just spoken, it was lived. In the village, Abigail's reputation grew, not with fanfare, but with the steady weight of reliability. When she promised to help widow Leah mend a sagging fence, she rose before dawn, her hands wielding hammer and nails until the job was done. When she vowed to pray for a friend's feverish child, she knelt each night by her bedside, whispering petitions until the girl's cheeks flushed with health again. Her actions matched her words, seamless as thread through cloth, and people began to call her a woman of noble character, like the one in Proverbs 31, whose husband trusted her heart without fear. Daniel often said, "Your word's as good as gold, Abigail," and she'd smile, knowing it was her faith that polished it. But not everyone saw her steadfastness as a virtue. A cluster of women in the village, their tongues sharp as thorns, took to mocking her. They'd gather by the well, their laughter ringing out as they traded tales of neighbors' missteps. "Join us, Abigail," they'd call, their voices dripping with false sweetness. "Why so serious? A little gossip never hurt anyone." She'd pause, water jug balanced on her hip, and offer a gentle smile. "I've promises to keep," she'd say, turning away. They'd scoff, calling her rigid, but Abigail remembered Hannah, who vowed to give her son to God and followed through even when it broke her heart. Like Hannah, Abigail held her words sacred, even when it cost her the ease of fitting in. Her loyalty wasn't a garment to shed when the crowd tugged. It was woven into her soul. One bitter winter, Daniel faced a sharper test. A wealthy merchant from a neighboring town dangled a contract before him, enough work to fill their larder for months. But the catch was clear. The merchant wanted Daniel to claim the wood was oak when it was only pine, a lie that would pad his purse. Daniel hesitated, the weight of their lean season pressing hard. He brought it home to Abigail, his voice a mix of hope and shame. "It's just words," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. She set down the bread she was kneading and faced him, her eyes steady. "Your word is your bond, Daniel. God sees what we do in secret. He honors truth, not trickery." Her tone wasn't harsh, but it carried the weight of conviction. Daniel wrestled with it through the night, pacing the floor. But by morning he declined the deal. They scraped by that winter, their meals thin, their fire small. Yet spring brought a new client, a man who'd heard of Daniel's honesty and sought him out. Work flowed again, and Abigail's hand rested on his as they thanked God for seeing them through. Her consistency, her yes meaning yes, her no meaning no, became their anchor, a lifeline in a world that bent too easily. She didn't just claim loyalty with her lips, she proved it with her life, in the small choices that built trust, in the quiet moments when no one watched but God. And as the drought lifted, the river swelling once more, Abigail knew her faithfulness wasn't just for Daniel or the village. It was a reflection of the one who kept every promise he'd ever made. The years folded into one another like the grain of the wood Daniel shaped, each ring marking a season of growth in Abigail's marriage. Their home, once a humble frame by the village edge, now stood firm with a wider porch and a garden where herbs thrived under Abigail's care. Daniel's hands, roughened by years at the workbench, carried a quiet confidence, and Abigail found joy in the life they'd built. Not lavish, but rich in faith. As their third summer together dawned, Daniel's eyes began to spark with a dream. "I could expand the workshop," he said one evening, his voice alive with possibility as they sat by the hearth. "More tools, an apprentice maybe, enough to serve beyond the village." Abigail saw the vision flicker in him, a calling she believed God had planted. She remembered Ephesians 5:33, the wife must respect her husband, not as a chain, but as a charge to honor the man God had given her. She leaned forward, her hands resting on the table. "You've got a gift, Daniel," she said, her tone steady. "God gave it to you. Trust him to carry it through." Her words weren't flattery, they were a mirror, reflecting his potential through her faith. Daniel's doubts lingered. He fretted over costs, over failure, but Abigail's belief bolstered him. She didn't push, she lifted, and soon he bartered for a second saw, his hands moving with new purpose. The workshop grew, orders trickling in, and Abigail's respect became the wind at his back. That winter, the village patriarch Eli shared a story by the firelight. Sarah, who followed Abraham into the unknown, trusting his leadership through faith in God. Abigail listened, her heart stirring. Months later, Daniel came home with a bolder plan. "There's a town 2 days west," he said, his voice tight with hope. "More people, more work. We could move, start fresh." Abigail's chest tightened. Her roots ran deep in the village, the riverbank where she'd prayed, the home they'd built. Yet she saw the light in his eyes, the same light she'd vowed to nurture. She thought of Ruth's pledge, "Where you go, I will go," and nodded. "If God's leading you, I'm with you," she said, her voice soft but sure. The move wasn't easy, packing their life into a cart, leaving friends who'd become family. But Abigail didn't waver. They settled in the new town, and Daniel's workshop flourished, his name spreading as a craftsman of skill and honor. Abigail's support wasn't just her presence, it was her choice to trust God's path through him. But respect didn't mean silence, and Abigail knew loyalty thrived in balance. One spring, Daniel took on an apprentice, a lanky boy named Micah, whose hands were eager but unsteady. Weeks in, Micah's laziness surfaced, tools left scattered, work half done. Daniel's patience frayed, his voice rising one afternoon as he berated the boy. Abigail watched from the doorway, her brow creasing. She waited until evening, then spoke as they washed dishes side by side. "Speak truth, Daniel, but with grace," she said, her tone firm yet kind. "He'll learn better from a steady hand than a sharp tongue." She recalled Proverbs 14:1, "The wise woman builds her house, and knew her role was to strengthen, not fracture. Daniel sighed, nodding, and the next day he guided Micah with patience, the boy's work improving. Abigail's wisdom didn't undermine him. It refined him, her respect a scaffold for his growth. Their unity faced a sterner test when a flood swept through the town, muddy waters clawing at their home's foundation. Daniel worked tirelessly to shore it up, but exhaustion darkened his mood. Abigail didn't retreat. She grabbed a hammer, her skirts soaked as she nailed planks beside him. "We'll rebuild together," she said, her hands steady despite the rain. Her loyalty shone not just in words but in sweat, in the way she stood by him when the world pressed hard. Yet even strong bonds bent under strain. One autumn, Daniel's pride swelled after a big sale, and he ignored Abigail's caution about a risky investment, a cartload of rare wood he couldn't afford to lose. "I know what I'm doing," he snapped when she pressed. The wood arrived worm-eaten, the money vanished, and Daniel's temper flared. "Why didn't you stop me?" he growled, his frustration spilling over. Abigail's throat tightened, hurt blooming, but she didn't strike back. She waited, letting the air cool, then sat beside him. "I'm not your enemy, Daniel. I'm your helpmate," she said, her voice low and even. Her grace pierced his anger, and he reached for her hand, murmuring an apology. They weathered the loss, leaner but closer, her support unwavering through his flaws. Abigail understood loyalty wasn't blind allegiance. It was a commitment to build, not destroy. She prayed for him daily, her whispers rising like incense, asking God to guide his steps, to soften his edges. When he faltered, she didn't belittle. She encouraged, her respect rooted not in his perfection, but in God's design. She saw their marriage as more than a union. It was a calling, a partnership where her strength held him up, just as his held her. And as the years turned, Abigail's quiet resolve, her choice to speak life, to stand firm, to honor him, wove a tapestry of trust that neither flood nor failure could unravel. The rhythm of Abigail and Daniel's life had settled into a steady hum in the new town, the workshop's clatter blending with the bustle of a growing community. Their home stood sturdy now, its walls weathered but warm, a testament to the years they'd carved out together. Abigail tended her garden, her hands coaxing life from the soil, while Daniel's reputation as a craftsman spread, his benches and tables gracing homes far beyond the town's borders. But peace, like the calm before a storm, proved fleeting. One summer night, a spark from a neighbor's hearth leapt free, igniting a blaze that roared through the streets. Abigail woke to shouts and the acrid sting of smoke, her heart lurching as she pulled Daniel from their bed. They stumbled outside, the sky aglow with orange fury, and watched helplessly as the fire swallowed the workshop. By dawn, it was gone. Tools, timber, dreams reduced to ash. Daniel stood silent, his face gray, his hands clenched as if gripping something lost. Abigail felt the weight too, a hollow ache in her chest, but Ruth's words rang in her mind. "Where you go, I will go." Which loyalty wasn't fleeing when the flames died, it was staying when the embers cooled. She knelt beside him in the soot-stained dawn, her hand on his. "God's still here," she whispered, her voice trembling but sure. They prayed through tears, their words raw, asking for strength, for hope, for anything to hold on to. The town rallied, neighbors offering grain and hands to help, but recovery crawled. Daniel's spirit sagged, his question sharp. "Why would God let this happen?" he asked, his eyes searching hers. Abigail had no answers, only faith. She thought of James 1:12, "Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial," and clung to it like a lifeline. To ease their burden, she took up sewing, her fingers stitching tunics late into the night, the coins she earned buying oil and bread. When Daniel spoke of abandoning carpentry, his voice heavy with defeat, she set her needle down. "We've faced worse and seen God move," she said, her gaze steady. "Hold on a little longer." Her resolve lit a spark in him, and he began again, salvaging what he could, crafting with borrowed tools. Her steadfastness wasn't blind. It was a choice, a refusal to let hardship shake her roots. A year later, a new trial struck. A thief slipped into their home under cover of night, making off with the small savings they'd rebuilt. Daniel's shoulders slumped again, despair creeping in like damp rot. Abigail felt the sting too, months of toil stolen in a breath, but she refused to echo Job's wife, who urged her husband to curse God and die. Instead, she lit a lamp and sang a hymn, her voice soft but unbroken, trusting God's promises over the emptiness of their jar. "He's never left us yet," she told Daniel, her hand squeezing his. Her faith wasn't a shield against pain, it was an anchor through it. Anchor. Weeks later, a merchant Daniel had once helped repaid an old debt unprompted, his coins restoring what the thief had taken. Abigail smiled as Daniel's eyes widened. God's timing, not theirs. Her loyalty stood firm, not because life spared her, but because her foundation was Christ, not circumstance. Trials didn't end there. A friend, Rachel, whom Abigail had nursed through a fever years back, turned bitter when Daniel couldn't craft her a cradle for free. She spread lies, claiming Abigail hoarded wealth while others starved. The words cut deep, betrayal a blade sharper than loss. Villagers whispered, their glances cold, but Abigail didn't waver. She sought Rachel out, her voice calm. "I forgive you," she said, offering bread despite the sting. She prayed for healing, not vengeance, her heart echoing Ruth's unwavering bond with Naomi. Her endurance wasn't weakness, it was strength, a loyalty that held fast when trust crumbled. Seasons shifted, and the workshop rose again, plank by plank, order by order. Daniel's hands found their rhythm, and Abigail's garden bloomed anew. But the scars of those years lingered. Charred wood replaced, coins regained, friendships mended, yet fragile. Through it all, Abigail stood unshaken. Not because she was fearless, but because she trusted God's presence in the storm. She remembered Ruth, who didn't abandon Naomi in grief or poverty, and saw her own path mirrored there. When Daniel faltered, she didn't flee. She prayed, worked, waited. When betrayal struck, she didn't curse. She forgave, held firm. Her loyalty wasn't a fair-weather promise. It was a vow forged in fire, tested by theft, tempered by slander. She'd learned that trials were fleeting, but God's faithfulness endured, a truth she lived out in every steadfast step. One evening, as they sat by a rebuilt hearth, Daniel took her hand, his voice thick. "You didn't run," he said, his eyes tracing hers. "Not once," Abigail smiled, the lines on her face mapping years of endurance. "I stayed because God did," she replied, her words simple but deep. She knew loyalty wasn't just standing, it was standing with purpose, with faith, with a heart that refused to let go. And as the fire crackled, casting shadows on the walls they'd reclaimed, Abigail felt the quiet strength of a woman whose trials had only deepened her roots. Her life a testament to a loyalty unshaken by storms. Time etched its lines into Abigail's hands and face as the years turned, her dark hair now streaked with silver, her steps slower but no less sure. The town had grown around her and Daniel, their home a steady beacon amid the churn of life. The workshop hummed again, its shelves lined with Daniel's craft, while Abigail's garden spilled over with lavender and thyme, a quiet gift to neighbors who'd weathered storms beside them. But age brought new burdens, and Daniel's strength began to fade. A cough took root in his chest one winter, deepening until he could no longer wield his hammer. Abigail watched him weaken, his once steady hands trembling as he sat by the hearth. Her heart ached, but she didn't falter. She brooded teas from her herbs, her fingers gentle as she pressed a cloth to his brow, her voice reciting 1 Corinthians 13. "Love is patient, love is kind. It always perseveres." She stayed up nights, tending him, her love not a flicker, but a flame fed by Christ's own example. His prayer on the cross for those who nailed him there. Daniel's eyes, dimming yet warm, met hers often. "You don't have to do this," he rasped once, guilt threading his words. She smiled, brushing his hair back. "I do it because I love you," she said, her voice a steady anchor. Her loyalty wasn't bound by his health or their past. It flowed from a well deeper than circumstance, God's unconditional love pouring through her. Beyond their walls, Abigail's heart stretched wider. A neighbor, Esther, faced her own trial when her husband fled with another woman, leaving her with 2 small children and a broken spirit. Whispers of judgment swirled, but Abigail didn't join them. She remembered Hosea, who pursued Gomer despite her unfaithfulness, a picture of God's relentless grace. She crossed the muddy lane with a basket of bread and sat with Esther, praying as tears fell. "You're not alone," she said, her hand on Esther's trembling one. She brought soup the next day, mended a torn cloak for the children, her love a quiet rebuke to the town's scorn. Her heart guarded against bitterness, choosing mercy over resentment. A loyalty that didn't demand perfection, but offered redemption. The hardest test came with their son, Micah, now grown into a man with his father's hands and a restless spirit. He chafed under their faith, his voice sharp as he argued against their ways. One spring, he stormed out after a clash with Daniel, his parting words a wound. "I don't need your God or your rules." Abigail's chest tightened, grief a heavy stone, but she didn't chase him with anger. She knelt by the window each night, praying for his return, her love unwavering even as silence stretched into years. She thought of Jesus, forgiving Peter's denial, and held fast. One autumn dusk, a knock sounded, and there stood Micah, thinner, weathered, his eyes wet with regret. "You never gave up on me," he choked, falling into her arms. "I felt your prayers." Abigail wept, her embrace fierce, her love a bridge across the gap he'd carved. "I couldn't stop loving you," she said, her voice thick. Her loyalty wasn't shaken by his rebellion. It endured, a reflection of God's heart for his wayward children. Abigail's life wasn't without stumbles. She doubted when the fire took the workshop, wept when the thief stole their savings, faltered when Rachel's lies cut deep. But each trial refined her, teaching her that loyalty wasn't a flawless march. It was a daily surrender to God's love. As Daniel's days waned, she sat with him, reading Lamentations 3:23. "Great is your faithfulness," her voice a balm to his fading breath. He slipped away one quiet night, her hand in his, and though grief clawed at her, she didn't curse God. She buried him under the oak where they'd wed, her tears mingling with thanks for the years they'd shared. In widowhood, she turned her love outward, gathering young women by her hearth. "Loyalty isn't just staying," she'd say, her eyes bright with memory. "It's loving with God's heart, patient, kind, enduring." She shared Ruth's steadfastness, Sarah's trust, Hosea's grace, her life a living lesson. She set boundaries with those who drained her, refusing to enable a drunkard's pleas for coin, but never withheld kindness, her love wise yet boundless. Micah stayed close now, his own faith kindled by her example, and together they tended the home she'd built with Daniel. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Abigail sat on the porch, her hands still, her heart full. She traced the years, droughts endured, fires survived, a son reclaimed, and saw God's thread through it all. Her loyalty hadn't been a gift she gave. It was a life she lived, rooted in the one whose love never failed. She thought of the transcript's words, "A loyal woman as a rare godly treasure," and felt the truth of it. She'd honored God above all, kept her word, supported Daniel, stood firm in trials, guarded her heart, proved trustworthy, and loved with a depth that mirrored Christ. No one became such a woman overnight, she knew. It took daily choices, grace for her own flaws, a heart surrendered to God's shaping. As twilight fell, Micah joined her, his voice soft. "You showed me what love looks like, Ma." She smiled, her silver hair glowing in the dusk. "I showed you what God's love looks like," she corrected, her words a quiet hymn. Her legacy wasn't in the home or the garden, but in the lives she'd touched. Daniel's, Micah's, Esther's, the women who'd carry her lessons forward. In a world where faithfulness flickered, Abigail's love stood firm, a rare and beautiful echo of the one who'd held her through it all.